Hello, and welcome to Ready, Set, Go, a webinar series sponsored by HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, also known as SNAPS. My name is Melissa Cogswell, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. On behalf of SNAPS, I want to thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is Performance Measurement in the CoC APR. We're being joined today by two national experts, William Snow and Natalie Matthews. William Snow was hired as a Presidential Management Fellow at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development in 2010. Since joining HUD, Mr. Snow has worked closely to analyze HUD's homeless data sources, to learn how to make data systems more efficient, and to use the data to help stakeholders understand the nature of homelessness and the efforts of providers to prevent and end homelessness. Natalie Matthews is a Senior Associate at APT Associates. Her work includes technical assistance for HUD's National HMIS Technical Assistance Initiative, management of TA for the new Annual Performance Report, and both local and national research evaluations of homelessness. We're also joined today by an expert resource advisor who will be responding to your questions online. Louise Rothschild is a Senior Analyst at APT Associates. Louise oversaw the national data collection effort for this year's Annual Homelessness Assessment Report and manages the Annual Performance Report questions submitted through the HUD Virtual Help Desk. Next slide. I do have some logistics for today's call. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour and is being recorded. The recording will be posted within 1 week on the HUD HRE website, www.hudhre.info. As an attendee of the webinar, your microphone will be automatically muted. Next slide, please. We do recommend that you use your phone rather than your computer speakers to hear the audio for today's presentation. There are approximately 1,000 attendees today, so there might be a slight delay in the advancement of the slides. If you experience any other technical difficulties, please request assistance by using the questions box in your GoToWebinar toolbar. Next slide, please. The questions box in the GoToWebinar toolbar is also the place for you to submit your content-related questions. All of your questions are important to us, but if you have HMIS-specific questions that are not answered today, please submit them to the Virtual Help Desk. Reference this presentation, Performance Measurements in the CoC APR, in your question. A brief feedback survey for this webinar will be emailed directly to the email through which you registered. We strongly encourage you to participate because this informs the delivery of our future webinars. Today we'll be asking poll questions throughout the webinar to test the knowledge that you gain. We really encourage you to participate as they help give us a sense of how things are going. As a final reminder, you will remain muted through the call but can submit questions through the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen. Next slide, please. Upon completion of today's webinar, you should be able to identify the key components of performance measurement, complete the performance measurement questions on the CoC APR, and understand how best to monitor the performance of your programs throughout the year. With that, I'm happy to hand the presentation over to William Snow. William?
Thank you, Melissa. Next slide, please. Thank you all for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you. Performance measurement is a very important part of what we do here at HUD, and we wanted to let you know as we begin this that it's something that we look at and we take very seriously. Reporting in the APR is not merely a reporting requirement to us at HUD. It's something that we use, and it impacts national decision-making for several different reasons and across several different goals. So we want you to feel that the work you do on the APR, and we know it is work. It takes time, and it takes effort, and it takes money to do it, but it pays off. I sit in meetings with legislative representatives. I sit in meetings with folks who work for the President's budget, and I cannot tell you how often they say, thank you for your data. Your data makes a difference in our decisions. So please know that what you're submitting is important to us, and we look at it. Now, this discussion about performance measurement is one of many of our discussions that we will have on performance measurement, especially as we move into the implementation of HART. Next slide, please. Performance measurement is often defined as a process that systematically evaluates whether your program is making an impact on the clients you serve and helps guide efforts to improve results. This is an ongoing process, measuring results, making program changes. We really feel strongly about this, and we want to see programs and communities doing this as needed. This is especially critical as we deal with changes in communities and the economic environment. HUD has two specific performance measures that it's collected for several years through its Continuum of Care grants. One is on obtaining and maintaining permanent housing, and another is tracking whether or not there's an increase in persons receiving income. These measures and others are available through what you submitted in your Exhibit 2 project application, and they are what we will focus on in our presentation today. Next slide, please. There are three key components of program and performance measurement. First, goals. You have to know where you're going. Second, data. Without a way to collect and report data towards your goals and performance measurements lose their value. We no longer can rely on gut feelings or intuition to decide where we're going and what changes we need to make in our programs. And three, follow-up. It's critical that once you've collected data, you've set your targets, that you look at your progress towards meeting those targets. A couple key follow-up questions for you guys to think about in your planning meetings are: how frequently should we collect the data? Who should see the data? What happens to programs that don't succeed? And how do results inform your day-to-day work? Next slide, please. A few other key questions that we'd like you to think about in terms of performance measurement include, what do our funders expect of us? Obviously, HUD is one funder. It's clear what we expect of you through our APR, but we know you have other funders. What do they expect of you through contracts or through grant agreements that you've signed? Another question to ask is, what additional measures do we want to set? Obviously, that flows right back into that first question. Often funders want to know very specific things. You need to think, are we collecting that? Do we have the capacity to collect that? And move from there. Recognizing, too, that data collection, reporting, all of it takes time, as you all well know. Thirdly, look to other programs in your community and look at their planning bodies as well. Local tenure plans, continuums of care. Often there are great ideas that are housed within those bodies that you can use to inform your own decisions. And lastly, if you don't collect the data, you can't measure it. So measuring that data and then looking at it is critical. So obviously, we're here today to talk more about performance measurement. Next slide, please. And I'll turn the time over to Melissa to go over our first poll question.
Great. Thank you, William. We have our first quiz. It's a true or false. Grantees and their stakeholders should only review the performance measures when it's time to submit the APR. True or false? Great. We've got about half the votes in. Grantees and their stakeholders should only review their performance measures when it's time to submit the APR. And it looks like about 98% of you got the correct answer. It is indeed false. Although HUD only requires grantees to report on their performance once a year in the APR, it is important to review these measures on a regular basis. Great job, everyone. Now I'm going to hand the presentation over to Natalie Matthews. Natalie?
Thanks very much, Melissa. So as William identified very early on in the presentation, performance measurement is a huge part of the work that HUD does. It's a huge part of the work that you all do day in and day out in terms of setting those measures and collecting the data. And now we want to spend some time talking about the two questions that relate to performance measurement on this CoC APR. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first point that we'd like to make about these questions is the fact that much of the work that goes into setting these measures happens at the time of the Exhibit 2, or the project application. So each and every year, HUD-funded projects apply for new or renewal funding by doing an Exhibit 2. And so on that Exhibit 2 is where you set your measures for the year ahead. So just in terms of timing, for grantees that submitted an Exhibit 2 or project application in 2010, now is the time in 2012 for you to be completing an APR and actually submitting your results on those measures to HUD. So in addition to having HUD-defined or standard performance measures on those Exhibit 2, what folks also have the opportunity to do on their Exhibit 2 is to do something called program-defined performance measures. And program-defined performance measures are unique to each individual program, and they're not required of all grantees. So again, there's two types of performance measures on that Exhibit 2, and you'll see them reflected in the questions. The first are HUD-defined or standard measures, and the next are program-defined measures that you have the option of coming up with on your Exhibit 2. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just want to drive home the point on this next slide about timing. So again, in terms of who needs to do what now, the important thing to keep in mind is if you apply for your funding in 2010, then on that Exhibit 2, that was the first time that HUD had the opportunity for grantees to fill out these performance measurement questions that are now reflected in the CoC APR. If you applied back in 2010, you got the funding, excellent. 2011 was when you actually implemented the program, collected the data, and now in 2012 is when you will need to report out on those measures in the APR. Okay, so anyone that's submitting an Exhibit 2 after 2010, you will still have the opportunity to set those program-defined and those HUD-defined performance measures. But again, it's only those grantees that applied in 2010. They're the folks that should be responding to those questions on the APR right now. One quick note before I move to the next slide about vendors. I do want to make it clear that the performance measurement question 36, that relates to the HUD-defined measures, that was something that was a part of the original programming specifications that vendors received. However, they will soon receive some clarifying guidance from HUD on that question, and so some vendors may opt to make some refinements to their system, or they may still be testing those questions, that performance measurement question. So please know that you will see the performance measurement questions in eSNAP. So if you logged in right now, you will see those questions. But know that you may not see them quite yet in HMIS, and that the important takeaway for you today is to go back to your vendor, communicate with them, get an understanding of when those questions will be live. And again, it's only question number 36 that is what you need to look for in terms of making sure that your vendor has programmed it. Okay, so please be patient with those vendors, and please be sure that you communicate with them soon about that question. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I mentioned a bit earlier, there is something called a standard performance measure, or a HUD-defined performance measurement. And these are, again, something that you set for yourself in terms of a target on your Exhibit 2. And every permanent housing program, every transitional housing, and every other type of program that's listed here on the screen have the same set of standard measures to choose from. And the importance of that is it allows HUD to take data that's submitted on the APR in this performance measurement question and report out on the performance of all of the HUD-funded permanent housing, transitional, or services-only programs. So it's very important that there are those standard measures that each and every program across the country that receives HUD funding is collecting the data and then reporting it out on an APR. The important thing to keep in mind here is that you're not going to see each and every part of question 36 on the APR. And what I mean by that is you are only going to see the portion of the question that relates to your specific grant and component type. So for example, question 36A is only going to be seen by permanent housing programs. 36B would only be seen by transitional housing programs. So it's critically important that when you are setting up your APR in eSNAP, that you select the correct grant and component type, because based on the responses that you give to that question in question number 3, that will determine which part of question 36 that you see. So again, you're not going to see each and every question. You're just going to see the part that relates to your program type. The one thing that I do want to mention is that there are 3 different types of SHP SSO grantees that are listed up here on the screen. We'll go into a bit more depth in just a minute, but I want to make it clear from the onset that you see reflected here services only street outreach. They have a separate measure. Services only with a housing goal, they have a distinct measure that's a part of question 36. But the SHP SSO types that we don't see on here are those programs that are funded and who are not street outreach and not with a housing goal. And the reason why we don't see those folks on here is because they do not complete question 36, but instead they complete question 37. So didn't want anyone to be alarmed or think that someone was missing there. Those grantees are reflected in the performance measurement questions. They just do not answer question 36. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the first part of question 36, as I mentioned previously, is just related to those questions, or just to permanent housing programs. And there are 3 distinct measures for permanent housing programs. The first relates to housing stability. And as we can see here on the slide, this measure relates to all persons served. So it's anyone in your permanent housing program who's maintained permanent housing or who's left your program and exited to a new permanent housing destination. The second type of measure that permanent housing programs are going to respond to in question 36 relates to total income. And these are clients who maintained or increased total income. So this would just be adults, but it would in fact be all adults that were served by your program during the operating year. The important thing that I want to note here for the income measure, and this applies to all of the income measures that are part of question 6, and that's that entering a program with 0 income and maintaining 0 income or exiting with 0 income does not reflect a positive outcome, meaning those clients who enter with 0 income and maintain or leave with 0 income will not show up in this question as having a successful outcome. So just want to make sure folks are clear about what HUD means when it says maintain or increase total income. Same logic applies to earned income, but on the earned income measure, instead of reporting out on the total income, you're just going to report out on earned income by clients who are adults just between the ages of 18 and 61. So there are, that segment of the population is, sort of in this question, part of the population that we expect to have the opportunity to be working. So that's why they would be included in that measure as well. On the next slide, we're going to see exactly what this question looks like in eSNAP. And again, if you logged into eSNAPs today, you would see this question in eSNAP. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's a little small, and I apologize for that. But again, you can see this a bit bigger. But what I did want to make sure we did with this question is show you what your screen will look like in eSNAPs. And the value of showing you this is that you can see, again, that there are just 3 measures for permanent housing programs here. It's the housing stability measures, the first one we see, and then the 2 income measures below that. So starting from the left-hand side of the screen that's on the bottom of the page, what we see is that the first 2 columns relate to the Exhibit 2. So again, on the Exhibit 2 that you completed in 2010 is where you said how many people you expected to be able to accomplish this measure. So you know your program best, you know how many folks come in and out of your program on average, and you made a guess on your Exhibit 2 about how many folks you thought would actually be able to complete that measure. So that's what you're going to enter into this first column right here. I do want to point out, though, that if you select to import data from your Exhibit 2, and so this is something that happens much early on in the process for you. This is a part of those initial questions that you answer when you're setting up your APR. If you opt to import data from your Exhibit 2, then the data relating to your performance measures will show up in these first 2 columns. So it's important that you check that, and it's important that you select the correct Exhibit 2. Only the Exhibit 2 that you completed for the grant that you're operating on, or that you're reporting on in this Exhibit 2, or this APR, excuse me. So again, it's 2010 is the Exhibit 2 that you would select if you're doing your APR right now in 2012. Okay, so again, this first column is those that you expected to accomplish the measure. And the next is the percentage of persons who were expected to accomplish the measure. So it's asking just for a raw number and then a percentage. And then what you're reporting here in the following columns are the actual number. So who actually did accomplish this measure, and what was the percentage of folks that accomplished the measure. So actual data in these next two columns, that should be coming from your HMIS. Exhibit 2 data, do not expect to get that from HMIS. Your vendor does not have access to your Exhibit 2, and so it's not data that can be pulled from there. It must be taken directly from your Exhibit 2. And again, that's something that will be auto-populated if you import data from your Exhibit 2, or it's something that you can look up by finding your most recent Exhibit 2 that you did. And again, it's 2010 Exhibit 2 if you're reporting out right now. These last two columns right here are something that eSNAPs will do for you, meaning eSNAPs will do the math, and will come up with a percentage of the number of folks that were able to accomplish the measure, and then the difference between what you set in your Exhibit 2 as a target and what your actual performance was. So it's very important that you take your time with these measures and that you, again, check with your HMIS to ensure that you can get the data out. And if the data is not a part of your APR right now, you want to be sure to communicate with your vendor and understand when those questions will be live in the system for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we move on to the next part of question 36, I do just want to reiterate the key points about who the universe of clients is for this question. So I've broken out the three measures right here on the screen, and again, for housing stability, it's all clients. So it's going to be stayers, meaning people who are still in your program as of the end of the last day of that operating year. And it's also going to be leavers, so anyone who's not in your program as of the last day of the operating year. Total income is going to be all adults, and then earned income, again, it's just going to be adults that are between the ages of 18 and 61. So hopefully this will be a helpful document and chart for you to reference later on when it comes time to actually go into eSNAPs and figure out what data to put in there. This is the universe of clients that your HMIS should be pulling the data from, and it's who you should be reporting on for question 36A. Okay, so those are the performance measures for permanent housing. And on the next slide, we're going to talk about the measures related to transitional housing, so question 36B. Next slide, please. Okay, so these measures may look very familiar, and the reason for that is that the measures for transitional housing are nearly identical to those for permanent housing. And the way that they're nearly identical is the difference that exists within the first measure, housing stability. So for housing stability, you're still looking at permanent housing as being the good outcome, right, as being the positive outcome that's being reported out here. But since transitional housing is not a form of permanent housing, you're not going to look at stayers. You're just going to look at clients who left your program, so leavers, as of the last day of the operating year. And the only clients that you'll report out on here in this measure as having a positive outcome are those clients that left and went to permanent housing as their destination. So the important thing to keep in mind when we're looking at housing stability and when we're looking at these other two measures is that, it's a lot to report out on. It's something that's very important, obviously, to HUD. But the thing for you as the grantee to keep in mind is that you are, in fact, collecting this data if you are collecting the data as it's laid out in those March 2010 HMIS data standards, meaning to get exit to permanent housing, you've got to have an exit date for your client, and you've got to have a destination entered into your HMIS. For income, you've got to have income and entry, and you've got to have income and exit. So all the key elements are there in your HMIS. It's just a matter of ensuring that you're collecting the data regularly and that your HMIS is programmed to report the data out. Okay, so just want to be sure that folks don't think there's some new data that they need to collect. All the elements are there in your HMIS if you are entering the data in line with those March 2010 standards. Okay, so those are the three measures for transitional housing. And on the next slide, we're going to show you again what the screen looks like in eSNAP so that you're familiar with what you need to look for. Next slide, please. All right, so the general format is exactly the same as what we saw for 36A, so I won't spend too much time on this. But the thing that I do want to point out here that I did not point out on the previous slide was that HUD gives you some instructions right on screen. Okay, so there's a lot going on in your life. You're doing quite a bit more than just listening to HUD webinars. We understand that. And so HUD has put the exact guidance that we just talked about here in terms of what your client universe is right up here on the screen for you, so that when you're in eSnaps, you can look at the data and go, okay, does that make sense? Does that look like that is all the adults that were served in my program? Does that look like all the leavers? So be sure to double check yourself and make sure that you're looking at those measures as they're identified right here on the screen for you by HUD. Again, transitional housing measures, very, very similar to the permanent housing ones, but there is a key difference that I talked about earlier, just that for housing stability, you're just going to be looking at leavers. Okay, so that is it for transitional housing. And on the next slide, we're going to see again that quick chart that I put together to show you what the client universe is for that question. Okay, so bear with us just one quick second. Excellent. Okay, so for housing stability, again, the actual number of persons served by the program for who this measure is applicable to is just leavers. Okay, so it's just leavers. And the way that you're going to report on them actually accomplishing the measure is you're only going to put in those clients who exited and went to a permanent housing destination. So again, this chart is telling you what you should see in those columns in eSnaps, and again, it should be coming from your HMIS. Okay, for the income measures, same guidance that we provided around zero income for the permanent housing, and that is that clients who maintain zero income do not count in the column as having accomplished the measure. You have to, if you enter with zero, you have to leave with more than zero in order to be counted in the last column as it relates to accomplishing the measure. Those clients will still show up as being a part of the universe of clients that could have achieved the measure, but if they entered with zero and left with zero or maintained zero income, they are not going to show up as having accomplished the measure. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk briefly about supportive services only, and specifically we're going to talk about outreach programs. So outreach programs, again, it all goes back to what you put in question number 3. You need to be sure that you select SHP as your grant type, SSO is going to be your component type, and then you'll be prompted in the system to say whether or not you're outreach. And so outreach only is what you would select, what you would have had to select, in order to see this question in eSnaps. So there are 2 types of measures for housing stability. The first are for supportive services only outreach programs. There's 2 types of measures. The first, again, housing stability. But what housing stability means for an outreach program is something different than what it means for permanent housing and transitional housing. And that makes a great deal of sense because it's a very different type of program than those 2 programs. And so what you're going to be looking for in this measure is all those clients who were placed into housing of some sort. So it can be an emergency shelter, it can be a transitional housing program, a safe haven, or it can be permanent supportive housing. The important thing that I want to mention here, though, is that for this question, you are counting all clients served by that outreach program. So it's both clients who were contacted as well as clients who were engaged. That will be your universe that we'll describe again when we go over that chart at the end. But just want to say that up front in case anyone's asking any questions. Contacts and engagements are the clients that are here. Okay, so that's what HUD means for housing stability for outreach programs. And the next is 2A through 2F, and what that relates to are service linkages. So again, it all goes back to what you stated in your Exhibit 2 about the type of service linkages that you would make in your outreach program. And the way that this will be defined is by having received a service, by the client having received a service for an identified physical or mental condition. Apologies for reading this, but again, want to make sure that people get exactly what HUD means by that. So the client had to come into your program, have an identified physical or mental health condition, entered into that HMIS, and then they were not receiving services for at the beginning of the program. But the way that it will count as a linkage is if the client is receiving a service for that condition by the time they leave your program. So for both of these measures for outreach programs, you're just going to be looking at leavers. And again, it's housing stability, or it's the ability of your program to link a client to a service for an identified condition that they had at the time of program entry. Okay. The next slide, we're going to see the eSnap screen, and I believe that this screen also looks a bit condensed just because there's a lot of content on the screen, so just bear with us 1 second as we get to the next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of text at the top. of the screen in eSnaps. But the reason for that is because it's going through each and every potential type of service link. Okay, so again, it's important that you look at your Exhibit 2 and that you see what was selected as the appropriate type of service linkages for your outreach program. Okay, and then you're going to be able to report out on those here. Okay, the one quick point that I do want to make about this is that, again, you have the option in the Exhibit 2 of selecting the most appropriate service linkages. Okay, so it's important that you go back to that Exhibit 2 and make sure that you identified what you wanted at the beginning, and then that you report on that here. So on the screen, you're going to complete all the service linkage measures that, again, were selected in your Exhibit 2. So if you just selected a couple in that Exhibit 2, then you are just going to report on those two in your APR. So it's very important that there's communication between whoever completes that Exhibit 2, who collects the data, and then who's reporting out on it here. The types of linkages are listed on the screen, and I'll just read them out very quickly in case folks can't read them. So the types of linkages are those for physical disability, developmental disability, chronic health conditions, HIV/AIDS, a mental health condition, or a physical health condition. So all of those types of conditions and types of disabilities, those relate back again to those March 2010 data standards. So it's hugely critical that you make sure that you are collecting the data you need. And to get these measures for outreach programs, you need to be collecting, in addition to program entry and exit information, you absolutely need to be collecting information on destination, again, for housing stability. You have to know the type of destination that clients are going to. And again, you have to be sure that services are being collected and that those linkages that you are able to make are being entered into your HMIS. Okay, so that is all for outreach. And on the last slide, on this next slide that relates to outreach, we're just going to, again, very quickly summarize what the universe is for this question. The reason for us going over this for each and every question is we understand that there's folks that may be listening with several different hats on. You may have an outreach program and a permanent housing program. So we want to be sure that we're absolutely explicit in what the universe is for each and every one of those questions. So again, housing stability for outreach. It's just going to be leavers, of course, because you're just looking at the destination for folks. And all the clients who are going to show up as actually having accomplished the measure are going to be those clients who exited and were placed into any type of housing. Again, for outreach, it can be safe haven, shelters, transitional housing. The important piece for outreach is that some sort of housing has been obtained. And then for service linkages, again, you're going to report on leavers for that, so that's going to be in the column in eSnaps that says the actual number of persons served by the program who could have accomplished the measure. That's who it's going to be, is all leavers. And lastly, in terms of who's going to be counted as being successful, it's those that were showing up in your system as having received a service for an identified need that they were not receiving a service for at the time of entry. Okay? So for outreach, we understand that data collection can be quite difficult and that it can be tough to ensure that you're collecting all this information. So the important pieces for you to do right now are to follow up with your vendor, follow up with your team that's entering the data, make sure the data that you need, again, it's services, so that's something that not everyone may be collecting. You have to be sure for outreach especially that you're collecting that, and make sure that you can get the data out of your HMIS. Make sure that the question is built into your system. All right, we are in the home stretch, so on the next slide we're going to talk about 36B, which is another type of SHP SSO program. But for 36B, we are only going to be talking about those that are with a housing goal. So this is not outreach programs. These are SHP SSO with a housing goal. Okay, and again, it all goes back to what you put in question 3 in terms of making sure that you see this question. These, again, may look very familiar, and so there is quite a bit of consistency for HUD in terms of what they set for types of measures. So it's really housing stability and income that they're looking at for several programs, with the exception, again, of outreach, who's wanting to look, HUD wants to look and see what sorts of linkages to services are being made. So for this question, 36B, for housing stability, again, it's just going to be people who exited to permanent housing as a destination. So it's all leavers for that. Total income, so income from all sources, is going to be those that maintained or increased, and it's, again, just going to be adults there. And then earned income, just as we discussed in the earlier questions, it's those that are just in that age range of 18 to 61, and it's maintaining or increasing earned income. So same rule applies throughout these questions, and that's that if you enter with 0 and maintain or leave with 0, you won't show up as having had a successful outcome. So you won't show up as accomplishing that measure. That's why it's important for you to realize that there. Okay, on the next slide, we're going to again see what it looks like in eSNAPs, just so that everyone has a quick vision of what it looks like there. And again, it's very similar to the other questions that we've talked about. So it's, for first columns, it's looking at your Exhibit 2. And again, if you import data, then the data for those columns on the left will be imported as well. If you don't choose to import the data, please make sure that before you start your APR, you've got a copy of that Exhibit 2 because you will need to have those figures handy to complete these questions. Okay, again, we'll have the actual number of persons served, who the measure was applicable for. That'll go next, and then who actually accomplished the measure. So one quick thing that I do want to make sure that folks realize again for this question is that in terms of data collection, for this type of program, again, of the others, it's all coming back to destination and making sure that you've got that in your HMIS. So permanent destination at the time of exit has got to be in your system. And then making sure that you've got income data for both entry, follow-up, or exit. That's what's going to make sure that you should, clients show up in this question as having achieved the outcome or accomplished the measure. Okay, and on the next slide, we're just going to reinforce what the client universe is for this question. And again, housing stability is going to be potentially all leavers. So I apologize for the typo on there, but it's just going to be clients that left your program. So housing stability, all leavers for 36C. And then in terms of who will show up as actually accomplishing it, it's leavers who have permanent housing as their destination. Okay, and I won't sound like a broken record by going through those in depth again for income. I think we've all heard that loud and clear, but I do want to just quickly mention that income only adults is who will be looked at for total income, and then earned income, it's just adults that fall within that 18 through 61 age range. Okay, so that is question 36D. All right, and again, we are almost there. We've just got one last performance measurement to talk about, and that is the one on the next slide that relates to safe havens, so question 36E. And for safe havens, we're just going to be looking at two measures. We're going to be looking at housing stability, and we're going to be looking at total income. So not earned income here. It's just housing stability and total income for safe havens. Again, you don't get to choose which portion of question 36 you answer. If you're permanent housing, you've got to answer 36A, and if you're a safe haven, you've got to do 36E. And just be sure that you go back to question 3 if you feel like you're not seeing the right question. But again, that's what's going to determine which parts of this question you'll see. So for housing stability for safe havens, what that's going to be is all clients who remained in safe havens or who exited to a new permanent housing destination. Okay, so for this will be all clients served. That'll be that whole universe there of staying in your program or exiting to a new type of permanent housing. For total income, it is also going to be all adults for this. And so for this question is going to be looking at maintained or increased income. So again, just to reiterate, want to be sure I'm clear about that. Housing stability, all persons. So adults, children, unaccompanied children, everyone who is served by your program and maintained safe haven as their housing or exited to permanent housing, they'll show up in this question for you. And then total income is just going to be adults. Okay, next slide, we're just going to see again what it looks like in eSNAP. Okay, very similar. The thing I want to point out here that I did not point out a bit earlier is that there is a narrative section. And so we'll talk about this in a little bit more depth in the next slide, but I want to make sure that folks realize that there is a narrative portion to this question. So you will see this for every part of question 36. You'll see it for 36A, B, C, D, and E. You'll see the narrative section, and we'll explain in just a few slides the purpose of that narrative section. Okay? So safe havens, again, it's just those two measures that you'll be reporting out on. And then the next slide will show you the client universe for that, so you have that handy when it comes time to report on this. Okay, so again, for housing stability, it's going to be all clients, adults and children as well. Anyone who stayed in your program, in the safe haven program, and anyone who exited and went on to permanent housing. So if a client exited and they went on to transitional housing, they should not show up here as having accomplished the measure. Again, it's really permanent housing destinations that HUD wants you to show in this question, and so that's who you should be thinking about and looking to in terms of when you're confirming your data there. Total income, this is going to be all adults, and it's going to be adults who maintained or increased their income. And again, zero income, not going to show up here. Okay, on the next slide, we're going to talk about that narrative section that I mentioned just a moment ago. And again, you'll see this for each and every part of question 36. And the importance of this is that it gives you a chance to say to HUD some issues that you had about the performance measures that you reported out on. So if there were any changes between who was able to actually accomplish the measure, you want to be able to report that here. Additionally, there were some slight language differences around the client universe in the Exhibit 2 from 2010 and in what you're seeing right now in eSNAPs. And so hopefully the guidance that you're seeing now, HUD has refined that to make it a little bit more explicit. But because of that difference, again, between what was in Exhibit 2 and what you're seeing now, there very well could be some differences. And so HUD wants you to explain those differences here. And I want to make sure that folks realize that HUD absolutely understands that 2012, this first year, is probably going to be a learning year for many people in terms of figuring out how to get the data out of their system. So please make every effort to communicate with the vendor, enter the data, and pull it out. But if you have any confusion or questions or issues about your data that you want to make sure HUD sees for those performance measures, put them here in your narrative. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to talk about question 36 versus 37. And so we have made some mention of 36 and gone through what this is required, but we haven't touched on 37 just yet. But the points to be made are that question 36 is the only one with the narrative. 37, the measures are set by HUD. I apologize, the screen is a little bit off right now, so I will just verbally make the point. HMIS vendors are not required to have programmed question 37 into the system. Additionally, HUD does not define the measures for question 37. This is something that you as the grantee come up with. Both in question 36 and 37, you selected what the targets would be in your Exhibit 2. So for both questions, go back to your Exhibit 2 for clarity on what to put there. Next slide, please. I just want to show what question 37 is so that folks have a handle on who's required to do it. So there are two types of grantees that are going to be required to do it. The more straightforward one is the second bullet on the screen, and that's anybody that said in their Exhibit 2 that they would like to do a measure that's something they've come up with on their own, a program-defined performance measure. If you put it in your Exhibit 2, you've got to report out on it here in your APR. That's the first type of grantee. The second type are those SSO grantees who are not street outreach or who are also not with a housing-related goal. So SHP, SSO without a housing goal, you will not do 36, but you will do 37. Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the data is not required to be programmed into your HMIS, but on your Exhibit 2 is where you identified how you would get the data out of your system. So if you said that you get it out of HMIS, please be sure that you do that. And you must use this methodology when answering the question 37. So don't look to your vendor to program it. They did not receive specifications on this, and the reason for that is that you all came up with the measures. They are purely program defined. Next slide, we're just going to see what question 37 looks like in eSNAP. It's a little different than 36. The similarities are in that you have data from your Exhibit 2 that comes up in this right here, and that's who the measure is applicable for and who you think will accomplish it. However, as you can see all the way at the left, you actually come up with the measure, so you type in what the performance measure is. And then again, as we did in the other questions, there'll be an actual number who accomplished it. And then lastly here, there will be a narrative section to explain in question 37 if you had any trouble answering the question or if you have any concerns about the data. Okay. Next slide, just to reiterate who the universe is for this question. The narrative, again, is where you provide insights to HUD about the project, so don't need to go into too much depth about that, but we'll remind you that it's a brief character limit there, so just 2,000 characters is all you've got to explain the measures to HUD there. Okay, next slide, please. All right. I'm going to hand it right over to Melissa now for two quick poll questions.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. So we have two back-to-back poll questions here. The first, in which application year did HUD first request that grantees provide performance measures in their Exhibit 2? And your choices are 2009, 2010, 2011, or 2012. Think back a minute. 2009, 2010, 2011, or 2012. Great, the votes are coming in. We'll give it just another second or two. Spectacular. All right, the correct answer is B. It looks like 83% of you remembered that it was 2010. Grantees had 1 year to operate their programs and collect the data needed to track the progress for the performance measures. And then starting this year, in 2012, they have to report on their performance. Great, let's see if you guys do just as well on the next quiz. For our next quiz, it's a true or false. For question 36A, permanent housing, both stayers and leavers are included in all three measures. True or false for question 36A, permanent housing, both stayers and leavers are included in all three measures. The votes are coming in. We'll give it a few more seconds. Everybody's giving this one a lot of thought. All right, so it looks like you guys were really closely split. The answer is true. Both stayers and leavers are part of the client universe for question 36A. It's important to note that only adult stayers and leavers report on the total income measure, and that only adult stayers and leavers between the ages of 18 and 61 report on the earned income measure. Great job, guys. Now we'll go back to William to hear about monitoring.
Great. All right, we've talked a little bit about the broad concepts around performance measurement. Natalie shared with us a lot of the technical details about how to report out on your performance measures from Exhibit 2 into your APR. And I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss how you monitor performance during the operating year. Next slide, please. There are a lot of stakeholders involved in performance measurement, and it is extremely important that there's regular communication with the stakeholders regarding these performance measures. As shown in this slide, grantees should be interacting with their CoC, with other grantees in the CoC, especially those that serve in a similar program type, and their system administrator. To the extent possible, all of these parties should be involved with the development and the tracking of performance measures. If your CoC has a vision for the types of targets that they'd like all of their programs to do in regards to a specific component type, i.e. permanent housing or transitional housing, whatever yours is, then you as the grantee should try to meet those targets. We recognize that those targets may be off a little bit, maybe slightly different due to specific circumstances or populations that you may serve. And that's a discussion that you should have with your CoC so that they understand why your targets diverge from what they've set. Or and perhaps have a discussion about changing the overall target so that all persons in your program type will be on a similar performance measurement track. It's also critical that you have a frank discussion with your HMIS system administrator. Generating this data is not always easy. We know there's a lot of it in the system, and it's important that you understand what's needed to be collected and that they understand as well. You need to know what your system is able to collect. As we heard from Natalie for question 37, the performance measures that you provided in your Exhibit 2 as additional performance measures are not programmed into, or are not programmed per HUD specifications into your HMIS. Those are things you had to ask the system administrator to do. We'd love to see those measures. We want to know what's going on, but it's critical that you talk with your administrator and make sure that you can get the data and that it's flowing correctly as well through the system. And they know how to run reports to make sure that the data is flowing correctly. So they're an important partner as you do your performance measurement. Also, it's critical that you look at this data regularly. We don't want to get to the APR reporting time and find out that something isn't working or some measure is incomplete. Next slide, please. As I just mentioned, reviewing performance measures is something that should be done regularly. We want you to build this into how you make decisions, various important agenda item in the meetings that you have with, again, the critical stakeholders. So grantees need to determine whether your programs are being effective. One way to do that is to look at your past grants, analyze your renewal projects. Important areas of analysis include the populations being served and outcomes in terms of length of stay and program exit destinations. Use this destination to set some targets for improving your overall program effectiveness. CoCs also should use the data to determine where the large gaps in the system are. They should inform their decisions as they think about new grants and what specifically your communities need. Grantees that are proposing new projects should use existing resources such as other program providers of a similar component type, and use that so you don't have to recreate the wheel. Let's take what's out there, use the resources we have, and become more effective. Grantees for new projects should use the renewal data to determine what program model to implement and to set realistic but challenging performance measures. Next slide, please. After reviewing past performance and setting targets, grantees should begin the process of reviewing their current performance. Grantees can confirm that they have the capacity to track the data before they set the targets. Again, as we mentioned, with the program-defined measures or the additional measures as reported in question 37, please make sure that that data is trackable and exists in the system. If trying to track changes in income, ask yourself, do I collect income amounts and types at both entry and exit for clients, and is the quality of this data good? A grantee should carefully review their null or missing values. That's a critical part of data quality review. CoCs should be looking at HMIS coverage rate. That should tell them a lot more about their community and perhaps what's missing and things to work on as you move forward. Next slide, please. As we've spoken earlier, talk to your system administrator, make sure that everything is accessible and that you can get the data out. Some important questions that we've highlighted here are, can I get the standard performance measures, i.e. those collected in question 36 out of the HMIS? Can you help me know the quality and completeness of the data that I'm collecting? Again, I want to highlight what I said earlier. The data quality for grants or for grantees, specific grants, is often reported through null and missing values, and for CoCs, it's HMIS coverage rate as well as null and missing values. And then ask, if I set up a measure for question 37, can I get this out of my HMIS? Next slide, please. Review these reports regularly. It's critical that you have the data and you use the data. The analysis is so important. We know that you have a million competing priorities, and we are one of your funders, but we're not the only funder for most of you. But please, please look at that data. That data will inform your whole project. It'll help you to become more effective and to achieve better results overall, serving more clients, helping them meet the needs that they have. So strive to make performance measurement a key part of discussions in staff meetings, continuum of care meetings, and in monthly or quarterly HMIS reports. As we move into HEARTH implementation, performance measurement is going to take on a greater significance. We're going to move from focusing only on project performance to continuum of care performance as a whole. We've received specific guidance in the statute itself about that, and we'd encourage you all to read that to start to think ahead. Be aware of what is being asked of you as we move into HARTH implementation. We'll provide more guidance on that in the future. Next slide, please. Let's conclude with a few next steps. Next slide, please. Review the resources that HUD has provided you. The one we highlight the most is the CoC APR guidebook. Please review that. It talks through the various issues and talks through the specific screens. Then find your Exhibit 2 project application for this grant. Obviously, as Natalie mentioned, you're going to need that to be able to measure the past expectations as compared to actual performance. Run your APR out of your HMIS to ensure that you generate the performance measurement data and ensure that the data quality is good. Again, look at your null or missing values and decide on the frequency that you should review those performance measures. Hopefully it's more than annual, not just at the time that you submit your annual APR. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, there are several resources that HUD has made available. We want you to have as much as possible. Access HUDHRE.info. There's a page dedicated to the APR. If you go under that Find Resource link in the middle of the slide, if you click on the down arrow, you'll see that there's an APR link. We have guidebooks there. We have trainings there. There are all sorts of resources. And again, we can't highlight enough the guidebook as being your first resource. Next slide, please. If for some reason you cannot find the answers that you need in the guidebook, and we are going to update the guidebook in the next week and publish it with performance measurement information. If you can't find it, your resource that you can go to is the HUD Virtual Help Desk. This is the only way to get an official response from HUD headquarters, and we do our best to provide you with a timely and thorough response. We know that sometimes there's a lag, and we are doing our best to make sure that we can serve the needs that you have. Thank you again for joining us on this call today, and I'm going to turn the time over to Melissa to wrap it up.
Spectacular. Thank you, William. So you should all now be able to identify the key components of performance measurement, complete the performance measurement questions on the CoC APR, and understand how to best monitor the performance of your programs throughout the year. I'd like to take a moment and thank William, Natalie, and Louise, as well as all of you for joining us. I'd also like to remind you to take a moment to complete the online survey that will be emailed to you. Let us know how this webinar achieved its objectives. We will use your feedback to help improve future webinars. Thank you once again for joining us, and have a lovely day.